Good morning, it's Richard Pearse from FinextraTV, and I'm happy today to be joined by Mike Groves. He's founder and CEO of Topolytics. Good morning.
Morning, Richard. How are you?
Yeah, really good. Always good to be talking to pioneers in the world of sustainability and data, which is what we're going to talk about today. So you're up in Edinburgh, and one of the things I was really intrigued about and that I wanted to share with the audience is that, when we talk, as we constantly do, about sustainable finance, about ESG, about data, we talk about the challenge of that. And people describe all sorts of problems. You work at it and come at it from a completely different level of problem, as far as I can see. And as we look forward into things like, supply chains, and we look at, how do we get the data from scope 1, 2, 3 on emissions, etc. It's going to be challenging. But tell us about your challenge and why you chose to take it on.
Well, if you talk about supply chains, I mean, we've decided to focus on what you might call a downstream supply chain, which is the waste and recycling kind of sector. So as a business, we're looking to make that world's waste system much more visible, so that you can then make it more verifiable and sort of build more trust in the data, and ultimately so that we can unlock value both in the material itself that's clearly going into that supply chain, but then also for those players in that supply chain. So if you think about it, you've got companies and organizations that produce waste and byproducts, or operationally, or they put products on the market and that packaging goes into the waste system. You've then got the companies and organizations that are responsible for moving and processing and doing something to that material itself. And then you've clearly got regulators and policymakers who are responsible for oversight of that system. And so that's really what we're trying to do. We're sort of trying to build this kind of systemic view on a global basis of what that supply chain actually looks like.
I mean, incredibly complex, and that's why people might think my reaction at the beginning, it's extraordinary. We'll learn more about it, but how did you come to this? What's your journey been, and the problem space you're addressing? Why did you particularly pick on it?
I guess I've always worked in and around environmental management, sustainability, for best part of 25 years or so. And sometimes I tell the story of I was working in Indonesia doing sustainable forest management auditing on behalf of the Forest Stewardship Council. So I spent my whole life for about 4 years in logging camps all over Southeast Asia and Borneo and Malaysia, Papua New Guinea, etc. But occasionally on the days off, one would, go to the beach. And of course, too often one would find, a sort of beautiful beach in the middle of nowhere. There's a tide line of plastic and flip-flops, etc. So sort of thinking, well, how did that material end up here? And so really, cut forward 25 years, and so what we're trying to do now is answer some of those questions about, and also try to sort of stop that material leaking out of the system, which is then ending up in the environment. So really that was the kind of that initial sort of thinking about, well, there is a bit of a problem here, but clearly the problem goes way beyond that, because we're just basically 60% of that material that we're generating as a waste in urban environments and cities is still going into landfills or waste dumps, or is leaking into the environment. And that's really what we're trying to change.
Yeah, we've all been, if we're lucky enough to have travelled, then we've seen what you're talking about, and it is always very disturbing. So how long's the company been going, and give us a sense of some of the, I don't know, kind of case studies, if you will, to tell us the journey of the company and the success that you're making.
Yeah, well, I guess at its heart, it sort of brings together, those sort of two parts of my life. I mean, I'm a geographer, so, so academically, remote sensing and geospatial kind of tech. But then professionally, sort of working around sustainability and environmental management, and I used to produce these big sort of annual sustainability reports. If you talk about ESG, clearly that's one of the sort of front lines in terms of the sort of data that's going into those reports. And so it sort of brought those sort of two parts of my life together, really. And so when you're thinking about waste, I mean, if you think about it from the point of view of as a resource, then it's clearly a physical material that's being kind of generated in multiple locations. It's then being collected and then moved, processed, and it's been transformed through a whole series of different sort of locations and ownerships before something actually happens to it. So actually thinking about the geography or the where of waste is absolutely crucial to then understanding actually what, number one, what is happening to it, because that's the first question that's often asked. And then number two, okay, what could happen to it? And that's really what we're trying to do. So that was the sort of the initial kind of impetus there, is to sort of bring together that, that desire to sort of really address that, the digitization within that sort of materials and waste kind of system and supply chain, but basically recognizing that there isn't a single source of the truth. And you've got lots of data now emerging from, you've got, waste management's no different to any other industry, in as much as, you've got the industry 4.0 started to happen. So you've got Internet of Things, you've got, the sensors, you've got sort of big data, you've got AI. All of that is sort of starting to sort of wash over the kind of the waste industry and recycling industry as it is any other industry. So what we're trying to do is pull that together with the, trying to sort of build this better sort of systemic view. And by doing that, we think that we can, ultimately sort of build a much better version of the truth, if you like. And so consequently, everyone in that supply chain can then start to make some, better decisions about both commercially and environmentally about that material and what happens to it, et cetera, et cetera.
So we interviewed recently Plastic Bank, and that's operating at a different level to you. Talking about obviously waste pickers picking up plastic, returning that to ocean plastic, and the whole cycle of working with large brands. How do you sort of see, what's the specific service that you do? Do you just focus on do you focus on the data and give that data to various entities? Tell us more about where you're focusing your particular business model and how that works out.
Yeah, so if we think about our customers, they would fall into three groups really. You've got companies and organizations that produce waste. So these could be manufacturers, retailers, infrastructure, transport companies that through their operations are generating material that then goes into that supply chain, goes into that, into that sort of waste and recycling system. And, the big challenge for them, and certainly this has really become a challenge over the last few years with the, certainly with the, obviously with what's happening around climate change, net zero, but also specifically around some of the regulatory changes around extended producer responsibility, around duty of care, around, recycled content, and all of those things. And so, and that's not just in the UK, but we're looking at, Europe, looking at Southeast Asia, USA, etc. So they're all starting to ask that question about, well, actually, what is happening to that material? Because in effect, we're outsourcing the, if you like, the management of that material to third parties, and we're relying on those third parties to sort of tell us what's happening to that material. But those third parties may only see that material for a particular bit of that supply chain. They may only be handling it for one part of that whole chain. So they can only give them a certain amount of information. So really for those customers, we're trying to answer those questions about ultimately, what is that material? How much of it is there? What happens to it? Where does it go? How far is it moving? What is the carbon attached to that movement? So we're answering a whole basket of questions there. And ultimately that then leads them into, well, okay, what do we need to change in order to sort of change the outcomes or reduce the impact and improve the level of sort of transparency and trust that we have over that data? And obviously for a lot of those companies, if they have to do reporting, particularly around, sort of mandatory reporting or sustainability reporting, it's then improving that sort of the data or the quality of the data, or it's allowing them to at least provide a level of confidence in that data if they're putting that data out into the, if you like, into the public domain. So that's one aspect, and that data, so the data we're working with, you've got the sort of underlying kind of, if you like, data on the infrastructure. It's like, where is waste handled? Who are the main players? Where are they? So this is the underlying geography. And then what we're doing is we're overlaying kind of really quite granular data in terms of the movement of that material. So a particular container that's being moved from one location to another. So this is in effect almost like a digital twin of their own kind of, if you like, waste universe. And then what we're then doing is we're aggregating that data with data from other sources and from other companies and anonymizing that, and that gives us a sort of more of a kind of systemic view of what's going on. And that then also has value to both to the waste producers, but also to the companies that are processing and managing that material as well. So that's why we're starting to sort of play it across the whole kind of supply chain.
So this is data when, you know, we've got a grip on it, if you will. Sorry, not data, but waste when it's going through its, you know, we've captured it and we're putting it back through with bales of plastic or whatever back through the system. Do you? I'm just curious. Do you sort of get down to the, you know, well, it's just a river full of just a jumble of stuff. You know, do you go down that far, or stuff's just, you know, spewing out of pipes or whatever? You know, I mean, that seems to be impossible, but you know.
No, well, I mean, we're dealing primarily with, if you like, solid waste materials. So sort of, you know, whether it be hazardous or inert, but it's recyclable potentially. So we're dealing with that whole range of different materials, whether it be metals, plastics, card, paper, organics, etc., etc. And so we can get quite granular. You know, we can get down to the level of an individual container that was picked up from a particular site and moved, you know, to another site. So you know, so you're getting down to that level, and so we know where the container is, we know what it is, we know what it should contain, we know what the sites, you know, should be sort of be able to sort of manage and handle, and so we're sort of building the picture up that way. But as you say, one of the big challenges with waste and waste data is that material can be mixed. So you get different materials mixed in the same containers. They can be then separated, and then they get baled again, and then they get sold onto third parties. And this is why, so a lot of what we're doing is data science and data modeling in the back end, because, you know, to be able to sort of follow an individual sort of, you know, item through that chain is very difficult, because there really isn't a perfect digital footprint for all of that material. So this is where data science allows us to, and machine learning, because we're seeing this data coming into the system on an ongoing basis, we can start to see patterns. We can start to sort of build a version of what we think that material is compared to what might be being, you know, said that it is. So you know, a lot of it is about building a level of confidence in the data, but that's still better than not really having any visibility at all. But the more we're seeing, the more we can improve that picture, and we improve the level of confidence in the sort of the modeling of what we think is happening to that material.
Fascinating. Do you see a time when, you know, using, you know, natural language processing, not, you know, perhaps looking at labels and shapes of bottles, and I've seen some examples where people are picking that out, or maybe that's too far down the granularity level for you?
No, not at all. I mean, so our model is data aggregation and analytics. So fundamentally, our view is that, you know, if you want to get a better view of what's happening across the whole of the waste system, where in some instances you might have like that machine vision data from, you know, polymers passing through, you know, materials recovery facilities, or you might have bin sensor data. So you've got data bins inside the sensors inside the bins that tell you when the bin is full, or you might have, you know, robotics for sort of, you know, then sorting. So all of that stuff is starting to kind of emerge now. But if you think about those sensor systems, they don't see the whole system. They see what they're designed to see, you know, so they might see a particular sort of flow of material, but there's all this other material that they're not seeing as well. So that's why for us, it's about aggregating from many different data inputs, and then we normalize that within our platform waste map, and then we can start to build up a picture of what we think is happening across the whole system with all of those different materials, with some of that data coming from some of those kind of, you know, machine vision or sensor systems, or you've got what also is happening is you've got deposit return, you know, schemes. Obviously in the UK, we've got one proposed in England and one in Scotland, and they will rely on some form of scan of a smart label, which will be on an individual item of packaging, so a bottle or a can. Now, of course, that data should be quite good data. So again, where we can access that kind of data, or where we could be operating, you know, sort of those kind of systems in terms of the data that's sort of sitting behind it, then that clearly gives us, you know, quite a good granular, high quality input. But what we're saying is that that's one input, but there'll be lots of other inputs, and some of those inputs may not be as good. But actually, by seeing those many different sort of sources of data coming in, we can start to, as I say, build that better version of what the overall system actually looks like. So yeah, we can get quite granular, and we can get quite real time as well, depending on how that data is being generated.
I think it's a great example because, you know, it's that whole sort of traceability, circular economy, and it's the aggregation of data using IoT and sensors and so forth that you're talking about, ingestion, normalization, and reporting. And I think for, you know, a lot of people still thinking in a relatively traditional, structured way, this is still quite new. But I mean, the great value of it all is that, as you've said, you're then able to produce the data for the, you know, the corporate and looking across its supply chain, who then reports to the financial services industry for their ESG. So although it's got a bad rap at the moment, you know, it's the beginning of a journey of, as you say, knowing more than nothing is a good thing, and it's going to iterate very rapidly, I think, to give people really good insight. Do you see any sort of examples that you can talk to us about, you know, which are either surprising, being a revelation to you or to the clients that you're working with, and just curious of the kind of outcomes you're seeing?
Well, I think sometimes you know, it starts with quite a sort of basic thing about really knowing what is happening to that material, and so there may be scenarios where, you know, in a sort of corporate sense, there are sort of corporate sort of targets, and obviously you know, a lot of those larger companies will have sustainability strategies or ESG strategies, depending on your point of view. And so there may be some sort of quite high level targets for a multinational, but when you start digging down into the detail in terms of what they really do know and the quality of the data that is then feeding into that sort of performance measures, actually there are gaps, and as a starter for 10, we're exposing some of the sort of shortcomings in the data that they might be working with that is then feeding into those targets. So we see a direct line between some of that sort of really sort of granular stuff that we're doing and some of those sort of corporate targets around, you know, sort of sustainability and ESG, etc. So that's that, you know, and you know, and that's something that, you know, maybe isn't surprising, but we're seeing that, you know, sort of substantive, you know, sort of challenges there. And then another one actually is just for a lot of companies where they might be dealing with quite a lot of different sort of inputs and contractors. It's just you know, just the volume of data and the time and the resources that are expended on just literally capturing and then managing and then processing and then reporting both internally and externally is quite significant. Yeah. And so we're absolutely, that's, you know, certainly really helping to sort of dramatically improve both the, you know, the time and the sort of the efficiency around that, but also, you know, actually then adding in this layer of actually how good or not is that data. So validating that data as it's coming in, yeah, rather than just basically accepting what's coming in, spending a lot of time and just sort of capturing and processing and dealing with it, and then creating sort of spreadsheets and reports that, you know, for internal or external consumption. So really, you know, that's something that we're definitely adding value through.
Fantastic. Well, look, time is running out. It's never a friend in these interviews. Give us an idea of where people can get in touch with you.
Topolytics.com, or you can find me on LinkedIn. But yeah, we'd welcome any kind of discussion, certainly around data as it relates to sort of waste and circular economy. So yeah, absolutely delighted to follow up with anybody.
Well, brilliant. We look forward to hearing from you again in the future. I think there's more to come on this, but carry on the great work and look forward to speaking to you soon.
Thanks, Richard. It was a pleasure.